Welcome to the Explainer. So, I want you to imagine waking up on April 7th, 2026, and realizing that the world as you know it might literally end before you even sit down for dinner. I mean, that was the terrifying reality the globe faced when the geopolitical boiling point between the United States and Iran hit its absolute peak. We are going to break down exactly how we got there today because the mechanics of this crisis are absolutely fascinating and honestly pretty chilling. Today, a whole civilization will end, one that will never come back. Look, this wasn't dialogue from some Hollywood movie script. This was the American president, Donald Trump, issuing a final ultimatum to Iran on social media. And the sheer gravity of this threat completely stunned world leaders. Was this the sign of an impending nuclear strike? We had the most powerful man in the world threatening the total destruction of an entire country. 90. When that terrifying deadline finally hit, there was almost zero hope for a ceasefire. But then there was this massive twist. Just 90 minutes before the strike was set to launch, the ticking clock actually stopped. A miraculous 2-week ceasefire was agreed upon out of nowhere. So how did the world got so close to the edge, and what on earth pulled us back?
Here is our roadmap for the crisis. 1. The brink of war. 2. Nuclear targets in downed jets. 3. A 90-minute miracle. 4. Blockades and peace talks. 5. The global ripple effect. And 6. A precarious future.
Section 1. The brink of war, 50 days of escalation. Let's look at how the world reached this boiling point. You know, this tension didn't just spike overnight. It was a total pressure cooker. President Trump actually gave Iran 4 distinct deadlines to open the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking March 21st, March 23rd, March 28th, and finally April 6th. And Iran ignored every single one of them. By the time April 7th rolled around, Trump's warnings had escalated into direct threats of targeting power plants and bridges, literally promising they would be burning and never used again. Over 50 days of this conflict, the human cost was just staggering. We are talking about more than 2,000 people killed in Iran, over 2,100 in Lebanon, and 39 combined U.S. and Israeli soldiers. To put that into perspective, that represents over 7,000 families destroyed and millions displaced across the entire region. These aren't just statistics on a chart. Moving to Section 2, nuclear targets and down jets, testing the limits. This is where the military actions very nearly triggered a global environmental catastrophe. The U.S. and Israel started targeting Iran's nuclear facilities, including the Natanz plant. But the most terrifying target? That was the Bushehr nuclear plant. It's Iran's only functioning nuclear facility and is packed with tons of nuclear material. 4 bombs were dropped right around it. Now, the Qatar Prime Minister actually warned about this exact scenario back in 2025. He said that if this coastal plant were blown up, the water would be completely contaminated. No water, no fish, no life. We were staring down the barrel of a potential Chernobyl-like disaster for the entire Gulf region. Then came April 3rd. This was a day that totally shattered President Trump's repeated claims of total air dominance because Iran actually shot down an American F-15E Strike Eagle. The pilot was quickly rescued, sure, but the weapon system officer was missing behind enemy lines. Despite his injuries, he hiked up a mountain to 7,000 feet and sent out a brief 3-word radio signal, "God is good." What followed was this incredible multi-step rescue operation. First, the CIA ran a massive deception campaign, feeding false info to Iran to throw off their search. Then, hundreds of Delta Force and Navy SEAL Team 6 members pushed into Iran. And yes, the airman was rescued, but the cost was immense. Rescue helicopters were fired upon, an A-10 Warthog crashed, and 2 Black Hawk helicopters took hits. Section 3, a 90-minute miracle, the ultimatum. The absolute climax of April 7th. As that final deadline approached, the rhetoric was at an absolute fever pitch. President Trump stated that destroying Iranian civilization wouldn't be a war crime because, in his words, Iranians are animals. In response to that, Amnesty International stated this could be seen as a threat of genocide. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General was out there warning that intentionally attacking civilian infrastructure is strictly banned under international law. It was so intense that embassies were literally telling their citizens to find safe harbors immediately. So how in the world did we step back from the edge? The answer is honestly incredible. Pakistan mediated the ceasefire. It turns out there was this direct diplomatic backchannel dating back to something called Operation Sindoor between Pakistan's army chief Asim Munir and Donald Trump. Pakistan leveraged this totally unique channel and successfully brokered a 2-week ceasefire, just 90 minutes before the American missiles were supposed to fly. Iran agreed to open the Strait, and the U.S. agreed to halt the strikes. Section 4. Blockades and peace talks. The deal collapses. Because halting the bombs, that was really only half the battle. A permanent ceasefire talk was quickly scheduled in Islamabad for April 11th. Those talks lasted 21 agonizing hours. The U.S. delegation, which was led by J.D. Vance, and the Iranian delegation actually managed to agree on many points of Iran's 10-point peace proposal. But the whole deal collapsed over one massive sticking point. The U.S. demanded a 20-year suspension of all Iranian nuclear activity, while Iran was only willing to offer a 5-year suspension. That gap was just way too wide to cross. And right after those talks fell apart, total chaos erupted on the water. President Trump announced a complete U.S. Navy blockade of Iranian ports, which created this bizarre double blockade scenario. America was actively trying to stop Chinese ships, which obviously led to stark warnings from Beijing. Then, by April 17th, Iran suddenly said the Strait of Hormuz was completely open again, causing global oil prices to instantly drop by 10%. But literally the very next day, they took a U-turn and declared the strait closed again.
Section 5. The global ripple effect. Neutral nations in the crossfire.
Because in our hyperconnected world, a regional war never stays regional, right? Take India, for example. They were a nation caught directly in the crossfire. Despite having historically friendly relations with Iran and even joint projects like the Chabahar port, India's oil security was severely jeopardized. 8 Indian-flagged vessels were forced to return just due to the rising tensions. One supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of Iraqi oil was actually fired upon by Iranian IRGC gunboats. Plus, India was forced to repeatedly request waivers from the U.S. just to buy Russian oil, and their current waiver expires on May 16th. And while all this was happening, India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar fully dismissed Pakistan's role in the mediation, stating that India didn't want to be a middleman. And finally, Section 6. A precarious future. The clock restarts. So, where are we now? Well, the peace agreements are frankly incredibly fractured. Just hours after the U.S.-Iran ceasefire was announced, on April 8th, Israel launched over 100 strikes in Lebanon, killing more than 300 people. How did that happen during a ceasefire? Well, there was a fatal confusion. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance claimed Lebanon was never included in the ceasefire parameters to begin with. However, official statements from Pakistan and Iran insisted that Lebanon and all other countries were absolutely meant to be safe under that agreement. And compounding the difficulty of regional peace are some really deep underlying policies. For example, on March 30th, 2026, Israel passed a death penalty law for terrorism offenses. But it's structured to apply only to Palestinians in the West Bank and not to Jewish Israelis who commit similar offenses. Critics argue that these types of disparate policies severely complicate any long-term, lasting peace efforts in the region. So what is the big takeaway you should have from all of this? Look, the 90-minute miracle saved us on April 7th, for sure. But that 2-week U.S.-Iran ceasefire strictly expires on April 22nd. If there's no deal by then, the risk of explosive global escalation is right back on the table. And that leaves us with one final, very provocative question. Even if the U.S. and Iran actually manage to hammer out a nuclear deal before that clock runs out, will Israel accept it? The fragility of our global security is literally sitting right on that knife's edge. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.